Welcome to Lesson 10 in the WPF with MVVM add-on course. We're nearing the end. In this lesson, we're going to create and wire up the tournament viewer form. That's kind of like the last form, the last stuff that we need to do in order to make this application fully functional with the new WPF user interface. While we're here, we're also going to fix some of the layout issues that the shell has so our application looks a little bit better. So let's jump right into this. Now here I have the tournament viewer form as it exists in the WinForms application. We're going to take this look and just replicate it into our WPF application. So let's start by creating our view model. So add class tournament viewer view model. Now that's a little bit of an awkward name, viewer view model, but we call it tournament viewer in the WinForm application, and I think it still works. We'll make this public. And this does not actually have any forms inside of it. It's just one form. That's it. There's no subforms. So we'll inherit from screen. Do control dot for add our using for Calibre and Micro. And we'll leave it there for now. Then we'll go to our views and say add user control. And this is the tournament viewer view. And like always, I'm going to swap this over for a left and right versus top and bottom. And I'll add the background of white. And because I probably forgot in the last one, let's go over to tournament viewer. Create tournament view. And of course, background is white. Let's take that off. There we go. So now we have our small white canvas for our tournament viewer. And now we can start working on our layout. Now let's start by putting our rows and our columns on. So column definition, let's say we have 4 columns. That's 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the last one would be a star. And then for rows, I'm going to assume we're going to need 7 rows. So let's do that. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. The last one being star. So that's my guess as what we need. We'll see if that's actually fits after we get into it a little bit. Let's start with row number 0. And we're going to say that in row 0, we're going to have one text block, and the font size will be a little bit bigger. It's going to be more like a 28 or so. And actually, let's give it a name first. And we'll say the name is the tournament name. And then we're going to say that it's on grid dot, let's unpin this, grid dot row 0 and grid dot column 0. And we can say, we could probably say that's going to span more than one column. Therefore, we can say grid dot column span is 2 columns. And inside a text block, actually let's make it a self-closing text block because we don't need to put anything in there because it's already going to be named the tournament name. So in our WinForm application, we had tournament : and then this, none in angle brackets. We replace none with the actual value. In this, it's a lot simpler. We just say tournament name. So that's row 1 or row 0. row 1. We're going to have our two things. So let's put a stack panel. And we'll say the orientation is horizontal. Grid.row is row 1. And grid.column is column 0. Inside a stack panel, we're going to have two things. First, a text block with the text that says round. So let's start with just an empty text block and it says round. And then we'll probably actually put a margin after this where we say it has nothing on the left. We'll have 10 at the top. We'll have 5 on the right and nothing on the bottom. So that's our round. And then we're going to have after it a text box. And that's going to be x:\name equals, and actually it's not a text box. Let's make this a drop down. So combo box. And the name of this is rounds. And then we'll also have in here the display member. The right and 0 on the bottom. That'll do. That matches up. So there is our stack panel. Now we can look at the next item down, the next row. Not sure what that was, it just popped up, but we'll see in a minute. See if we have any problems. And now we can say inside round 2, we're going to put one thing, and it's a checkbox. And the name is unplayed only. And so then this checkbox, we're going to say is on grid.row2 and grid.column 0. And then inside the checkbox, we're going to say unplayed only. And we'll see how that lays out compared to the rest. I do already notice we need to have a margin on it, where we have 0 on the left, 10 up top, 0 on the right and bottom. So that should take care of the unplayed only list, or the checkbox for the list. And now we need row 3. And inside here, this is going to be a list box. And the name will be matchups. And then we'll also have our grid.row. That's row 3. and grid.column, that's column 0. And now let's have our display member path. And this is the specific thing to select or to show when you are displaying a list. I don't remember this either, so we'll have to get that from our matchup list as well. So we'll say that this is the matchup text. Is it? No, it's not. But we'll put something in there just to have it, and then we'll fill it in. And we can just remember we need both the one up here, the display member path for combo box, as well as for the list box. And then we also need to have our selected item. And that's a binding. And the path equals selected matchup. And the mode equals one or two way. There we go. So there is our binding for our list box. So that will be our set of matchups. Now that's in row 3 in column 0, but then we also have other things in that same row. And in fact, I want to do a row span on this to say it's going to span 3 rows, rows 3, 4, and 5. So that's going to be a span vertically, because the next 3 items, and I'll drag this form down. I've been looking at it up top. So this we've got so far is all the way down through here. Let's undo that. This right here. But now I want to add this right here, and this right here. So what I've said is these are all in column 0, but this is column 1 and column 2. And what we'll do is say this is row 3, row 4, and then row 5. So that's the goal for how we're going to lay this out. So let's drag this off a screen again. And now let's do, still in row 3, I'm going to say, it messed up my tab, it looks like. There we go. I guess it was the same spot. So let's say we need a stack panel, and we're going to say that grid.column is 1, and grid.row is going to be row 3. Inside a stack panel, I need to change set the orientation. The orientation is going to be vertical. Inside here, we'll have a couple things. First of all, a text block. And this text block is going to have a name, because it's actually going to have a value put into it. And it's going to be called team1. And then we're going to need to have some margins on this. So the margins here, we're going to need to say that we want, let's start with nothing on the left and right. On the top, we don't care either. On the right, we don't care. And the bottom, let's get a margin of 5. And now we could put margin top for this list box and this stack panel, or up here in row 2, we can actually where we say the only margin we really care about is to the right, at least for now. You can always come back and edit margins. That's a huge margin. There we go. So to the right, we're going to have a 5 pixel margin because then we have a text box. And this is going to be Team 1 score. And we may change these names, what to figure out depending on, because these are objects that are selected. So we could just point right to the object. We'll see. But for right now, this is where we're at. We're just kind of roughing in the form. So you have the name is Team 1 score. And that should be all we really care about. We can come back and modify that if we need to. Maybe you'll put a minimum on here. A minimum width. And let's say the minimum width is, let's look at 50. That looks about right. So there we go. We have Team 1, which will be named right up here, and their score. Now, below this, we're going to have that versus. So that's on row number 4. And there, we're going to have just one text block. And we'll have a margin above it. So nothing to the left or right. Above it will be 10. And then on the right will be nothing. And then the bottom will also be 10. We'll start like that. We could have said 0, 10 instead of 0, 10, 0, 10. But this way allows us to tweak it later more easily. And this text block, we're going to say, it says dash vs dash. We also need to put it in the right spot. Notice it's up here in the left right now. It needs to be on grid.row number 4 and grid.column number 1. And we also need to center it. So let's put that in a nice line just because it's a little more readable. There we go. There's row 4. Now, also on row 4, in the next column, we're going to have a button. That's going to be score match. And we'll need to put that on grid.row 4. Grid.column 2, and then we'll make sure we have the correct margins around it. So margin to the left should be 10 pixels, top isn't a big deal, right isn't a big deal, and bottom isn't a big deal. We'll say that the button says score. We also should add some padding in here. Five sounds good for that. Maybe you could say something more like 10.5 or maybe even 15.5. Make the button a little more significant. So there's our button for row 4. Now row 5. In this row, we're going to have the same thing we had in row 3 with our stack panel. So let's copy this entire thing. We'll paste it down here and change from row 3 to row 5. And we'll say it's team 2. And it's score for team 2 score. So there we go. Team 2 and their score. And so it's team 1 and their score versus team 2 and their score. Hit the score button to actually call the score out. Now, this form right now doesn't have a lot going for it. The one thing I noticed right away is I should put some margins on the right for my list over here. So let's do that. So let's look for margins. Do we have any margins at all? We don't. So let's add margin. Left is fine, top is fine, right should be 10, and bottom is fine. That should be okay. So now we have our really ugly and hard to read form. We'll figure out if we need to change this once we put some data in and see how it looks. The one thing I think we're going to see is that this, we probably should have done the opposite direction and done our view model first, just because we're going to have to change a lot of these names. But I think that's okay, because if we did the view model first, we'd probably have to change a lot of names anyways. So I'm okay with it. It's not perfect, but neither are we. So let's start. I'm going to drag this actually off a screen. And now let's talk about our view model. So the first thing we need to have is the data being passed in to say which tournament we're working on. And I think the best way of doing that is passing it in via the constructor. So let's actually start by creating a property for the tournament that we're working on. We'll create just a regular auto property, not the full property. And we'll say tournament model and do control dot, add our using statement. And we'll say that this is called the tournament that we're working on. Then what we can do is say CTOR, and you need to pass in a tournament model called model. Then what we'll say is tournament equals model. So whenever we instantiate the view model, we're going to pass in the tournament model that we want to work with. That way we know all the information we need to, which should make a lot of our job easier. Now let's bring back our WinForm version. Let's go to the code behind for this to see how we set it up here. Same way, we pass in the tournament model. We initialize the components. We start setting up some basic information, like our events, our model. We wire up our lists, which our wire up our list is just for the drop downs. Load form data is where we load the name, and then load rounds. That's where we create all of our rounds. Let's actually take this rounds and copy it over to our new form. There's no reason to duplicate this code if it's going to mostly work the way you want it to. Now, the other thing I'm going to want is this load matchups in just a minute. So let's grab this first and bring it over to our view model. There we go. So now what happens is we have this rounds, which in this case is a binding list of int. So we created this binding list of int in order to have which rounds we're working on. Well, we could do the same thing for here. Well, let's create a prop full. And we'll say binding collection, since we're in WPF, of type int. And we'll call it underscore rounds. And we'll call it rounds. So now we have our bindable collection called rounds. Now let's initialize that list equals new bindable collection of int. And then here we'll use a capital R for rounds. And we'll start adding our rounds. Now it says matchups in tournament. Well, that's capital T as well. So we'll change that. So tournament.rounds. and it's going to go through and add each round to our list of rounds. And finally call load matchup on 1, or the first round. Let's come over here to our load matchup, and we'll grab this as well. And we'll paste it in. And it says for each round in our tournaments list, it says selected matchups. Well, what is selected matchups? Selected matchup is a binding list of our matchup model. Well, that's because we have something similar, which we called our matchups. So up here we need to create a property. And yes, this can get confusing. But if you follow along and kind of pay attention to what we do in our WinForm app and just replicate it over one bit at a time, we'll be able to basically duplicate our code in the WPF app and just modify it for WPF. So in this case, we have a bindable collection of type matchup model. Call this matchups. We'll move that up to underneath the other private int. There we go. So now we have our matchups bindable collection, and down here we can just say instead of selected matchups, it's just called matchups. We'll clear that out. We should also make sure we initialize this, just in case. And it says, okay, grab all the matchups, and it's going to add them to our list. So matchups.add. But we first have as unplayed only checkbox. We have a checkbox on our form. It's just called, let me look at it real quick. It's called unplayed only. So let's come up here to our properties. Prop full bool. We'll paste it in, unplayed only. Make it a private backing field by doing underscore lowercase u. Unplayed only. And we'll also set the notify of property change. And then we'll move our private boolean up here. So now we have unplayed only. So instead of unplayed only checkbox, and as needed. So load matchup we now have, but it's not quite right yet. Now before I was thinking through, we have the team 1 name and the team 1 score. I was thinking maybe we could just pull that directly from the matchup object instead of trying to hard code, pulling it out and putting it into certain properties. The problem with that is, for one, it's in a list, and there could be 1 or 2 items. That's problem number 1. And problem number 2, if there is only 1 item, we want to add that by week for team 2. So we do need to have team 1 for the name and the team 1 score, team 2 for the name, and team 2 score. So we'll move our backing field up, and we'll add our notify of property change. We can minimize that. And now we need our scores. We call these team 1 score and team 2 score. So prop, and the score is a int, I believe, but let's make sure of that by going to our matchup model. And then let's look at the matchup entry. Team competing, the score is actually a double. So just follow the same pattern for team 1 versus team 2. And the same pattern for creating the full properties. Doing the same thing the same way every time. It can get repetitive, but that's good, as long as you don't fall asleep on the job while you're doing it. So there you go. Team 1 and team 2 both have their name and their score. So then down here, we have, it's capital T, and there's no dot text, and it's no name. So team 1 and team 1 score. We don't need a .to string. So we have our team and we have our score, and team 2's name is just team 2. And the score is team 2 score with a capital T. And that would be a 0, not a 0 inside of quotes. Same down here. This will be a 0. And this will be team 2 score. And this will be team 1. Like so. And now we do the same thing down here, where we say team 2 name becomes just team 2. And team 2 name down here because just team 2. Team 2 score right there and right there. And the to string goes away. And this becomes a 0. All right. So now load matchup seems to mirror what we already have. So load matchup seems to work. And now we need to get display matchup info. So let's look at what display matchup info does. where it actually makes visible or invisible the Team 2 name and score and all the rest. So it kind of hides that if nothing is selected and makes it visible if something is selected. So we can actually probably hide or delete that for now. I don't think we're going to need that. And next, let's look at what happens on certain events. So round drop down change, this happens. Well, let's make sure this happens as well for us. Now, the only problem I have right now is I've changed an awful lot of code and I haven't tested it. So before I even get to this, so I know that nothing's going to happen right away of any consequence. But before I even get to this, I'm going to save this. I'm going to look to actually load this in our shell. So I know I need to pass in through the constructor. I need to pass in the, let's move the constructor up. I don't like it that low. Let's move it right up underneath our private variables. Like so. And we broke something here. I know what we did. For whatever reason, it looks like we moved between the view model and the form. So let's undo that. And this time, instead of dragging it, I'm going to cut it. And I'll paste it where I want it to go. So I dragged it. I evidently dragged it to the left a little bit. And I decided, oh, you want to go over there, which I did not. But it thought I did for some reason. So I moved up to the top. So let's load this tournament viewer view model and pass in the tournament model we want to work on. So let's go over to our shell view model. Let's actually look at shell view first. So we have this existing tournament list. All right, so if we click on this, our list box says selected tournament. So let's go over and look at the selected tournament in our shell view. And we haven't actually moved our private backing fields together. That irritates me. There we go. So selected tournament we have right here, we notify of property change whenever a tournament is selected. Now, we could bind on something more significant, like if we said double click or something like that, we could do it. But I'm going to say whenever you select a tournament, I want you to trigger the load that tournament view in the main form. So I create, down here I create a load tournament method. I'll actually create right below create tournament actually. Public void load tournament. Now so this gets called whenever a tournament is selected. So I'm going to say if selected tournament dot tournament name. I'll actually wrap that. So let's cut this. Not string dot is null or white space selected tournament name. So it's saying as long as there's a tournament name that you selected, then here's what we're going to do. We're going to say activate item new tournament viewer view model. We're going to pass in the selected tournament. That's it. So in theory, if we were to run this right now and click on a tournament, it should be that we see that tournament. Let's try first tourney. Nothing seems to have happened. Well, that's okay. When at first it doesn't happen, you track down why. Debug, debug, debug. let's start by putting a breakpoint on our load tournament code. And the very first thing I see is, where are we calling this? Well, if you can see, it's really tiny, but it says right here, 0 references. Well, if you're not So this was the, if we created a new tournament and it came back, then what we'd do is we would say, okay, then put that into our list of existing tournaments and select it. That way we then go right to viewing it. Let's start this and see if it works. And immediately we get this system.null reference exception. So we have a load tournament and we say select a tournament, and select a tournament is null. Well, that's a problem. We can't load a tournament for a null tournament. So let's stop it right here and say if not, well, let's say not, selected tournament is not equal to null, and that it checks first to see if it's null. If it's not null, keep checking. Let's run this again. And the reason why this will work is because if statements, and I'll move this out of the way for a minute, if statements check in order. And if this fails right here, it stops because it knows the entire if has failed because of the and. Neither of these sides can be false. So if this is false, it's done right here. Therefore, it won't come across this error because it's not even going to check for that. Now, if this is not null, this won't be an error. Therefore, we can check it. All right. Now let's select first tourney. And that seems to have done something because we've got the viewer now. If we hit create tournament, we have this. If we select another test, we come back to this. So it looks like something's happening, but we're not actually populating this list here very well. And we're not populating this list very well. But I would imagine something's happening in the back end because otherwise this wouldn't show at all. Now I think the problem is our naming. But to be certain of that, let's go back over to our tournament form. And we can come up here. This is actually not the right one. This is the form. We want the view model. And let's say that in our tournament viewer view model, the first thing we do is set the tournament equal to the model, put it into the tournament. Now we have this load rounds stuff, but again, we're not calling this. So that's a problem. So we know right away that we need to actually call this load rounds, which should happen in the constructor. Load rounds. Now, if we were to check back over here in our form, which is our WinForm app, we call load rounds. So we should have known to do that. So that's one thing, but I still think we have a problem with our naming. have our list of rounds right here. Now we said round number, but the reality is we shouldn't have this because it's a list of int. We don't have a name for our value. So let's see if not giving it a name will work. And if not, we'll actually figure out what to do in that place. Let's start with just that and see what happens when we load a tournament. So first tourney, we have uncanny losers, score of 1, versus a bye week, score of obviously 0. Rounds, we have round 1 and round 2. Now it's not changing anything in the list, but at least we have something. Now this one has 3 rounds, but again our list isn't showing anything. It does show, looks like 4 matchups in round 1. It's just that we can't see their names. But that's okay. We're making progress. So next, let's figure out what the names should be for this. This list box says display mirror path is matchup text. Well, I would guess that here we've set something. So let's look at what we set when we wired up our matchup. We wired up display name. So if you see the matchup list box.display member is display name, well, we should do the same thing for here, display name. Let's run it again and see what happens. We have first tourney, there's our 2 teams. Basketball tournament, 4 teams. So now we have our list. That doesn't do anything, doesn't seem like. We can try it again, a different one. Doesn't seem to work. And when we select a different team, nothing happens over here. So we got to do the next step. And what's the next best step? I think is to, when this changes, change this over here. Then we'll get to the checkbox. So we have the selected matchup. So when that changes, we want to change the information on the right. Well, let's go over to our view model. And we have this load matchup and pass in the matchup model. So whenever we select an item, which would be a matchup, we're going to change the matchup model. But we don't have yet that selected matchup. So let's do that. Let's create a selected matchup. So let's come down here after our last property. On selected matchup. So whenever we select a matchup, it's going to change this selected matchup. But it's also, I want it to call load matchup. Load matchup and pass in, instead of passing in our matchup model, we could just say whatever's selected. So the question is, where does this get called in here? So we're saying, okay, the first one gets added. So I think what we need to do is, instead of adding the first one, let's just finish this out right here. Instead of adding the first one, what we'll do is we will set and as long as all my errors go away, this should be all we need to do. Now, let's run this again and see if it changes whenever I change which one I selected. So I'll select basketball tournament, uncanny losers versus bye week, Sue's team versus bye week, Greg's team versus bye week, and team first place versus Mary's team. So it seems to have worked. And now if I select, for example, this one in first tourney, Sue's team actually has a score of 124 versus Uncanny Losers has a score of 1. So we know that scores are coming through, but that checkbox still isn't working. So it looks like we should have a round. So we have right here our round, then we have our selected round. Let's make sure we have this property. So I don't see an int for selected round. So let's add that. So we've broken a couple of things, and that's okay. Int selected round. And we'll move this up where it should go. with the rest of them. And then we'll come back down here and add our notify. I can minimize that. So now, well, actually, let's not yet. So now whenever this changes, I want to load the matchups. So now whenever the round has changed, I'm going to load the matchups. Now, inside of load rounds, I load matchups for 1, but instead I'm going to say selected round equals 1. That will set the valid round to 1, and it will then load the matchups. So doing the same thing we did with our actual matchups and which one was selected. So that fixes one problem. Now the next problem to fix is this load matchups where we say round, where it's actually selected round we want. So I'll grab that and say selected round. And that's all we need to do, it seems like. The rest seems to load or take care of itself. Let's try it. So load this back up. We'll select the first tournament that comes up in our list. And it's red right now. It's interesting, but let's select round 1. And it says, oops, you've got a problem. So let's look at what the problem is. Selected matchup is null. Therefore, we can't look at, and this is an artifact of that dropdown. It's kind of stuck on the screen for now. So if selected matchup is null, we can't obviously get the entries for it. So let's do this and say if selected matchup equals null, return. So if there's no selected matchup, don't do anything, just get out. Let's first of all see if that fixes the issue. We can select the different teams. If we select a round, it seems to work. Even round 2 works. I don't like the fact that it starts off at that red indicator. So let's figure out how to resolve that issue. Before we do though, let's check this unplayed only and notice that everything goes away. In round 1 and round 2 we actually have something, but again round 2 nothing. Except we do see Uncanny Losers versus Sue's team, which is the first one in the list, the last time it was available. So that's a problem. We need to hide this. That's why we had that hide from before. So we'll work on that in a minute. But let's look at why this round is being set to that red mark first. Let's start with looking at what the selected round starts at. It starts at null, or I'm sorry, 0. But let's put it to 0 again. See if that just helps. If it starts out with a starting value of something. It's always good to try the easiest stuff first. And nope, that is not the solution. So let's figure out the next logical solution. Now I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because it might be something just minor. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here to my selected round. That's where the value is getting changed. And I will put my breakpoint right here whenever it changes. So let's start this. And when it comes up, I'm going to select the first tournament. And it says, okay, the selected round has changed. The value is now 1. So I'm going to mouse over that and step over it and step over the notify. Before I get to load matchups, I'm going to make sure I look at my properties. Selected round is 1. So load matchups. I'm going to skip over this. and hit run. And it still says my value is invalid. And that doesn't seem right. It seems like it should be 1. It should be the correct value. So I think there's just some kind of weird glitch in here we haven't noticed, but it does seem to be working correctly in the fact that it's switching rounds like it should. And I can hit play here. So it's switching rounds like it should. It's hiding ones that if it needs to hide them. So I think the issue isn't what I'm going to worry about. I can come back and play with that, but it's really a minor quibble right now for us. I want to get through and finish this application instead of just poking around with minor things like this. So let's go on here. Let's make sure it unplayed only. And we want to hit 1 for Greg's team and hit score and have something happen. So does something happen? Not yet. We want the score button to be wired up. Right now it's not. That's the last thing on this form we need to wire up. So let's figure out what to do in the score button. So let's collapse all these others down that we don't need and find out where we have the score method. In this case, it's actually, I believe, called score match. So I don't believe we have that anywhere. So let's say public. I can't use all these privates up here. Public void score match. And so this is going to be triggered whenever they click that button to score. So what does this button do? Well, here's all the code that it does. So let's go through and actually grab all this code. Come back. Score value, but we don't need to do that because we already know the score is valid. So we can just say team 1 score, and that should work. We can take out all of this code and all of this code. So if team for entry 0 is competing, then take their score and put it into their score. And again, down here, we can make this a capital T. We can take out all of the check to make sure it's a valid value stuff first and afterwards. And that really shrinks down our logic. We also can take away these 2 variables since we don't need them. And now we say tournament logic. Well, that's control dot, that's in our library. And we pass in the tournament, which in this case is a capital T. Now this updates the results for the tournament. We're going to skip over the message box for now. We'll come back to that in a minute. Load matchups, where we pass in the round drop-down selected item. We don't need to do that. We can just take this away and say load matchups. Because remember, load matchups pulls from the already selected value for which round to load. Now let's talk message box for a minute. In WinForms, it's just messagebox.show. Now, WPF is a little more sophisticated in its design, but the reality is that it does have a message box if you really want to use it. In this case, I kind of do for two reasons. One, it's really quick. I don't want to design a new form and have it pop up and all the rest. Two, it mimics what we already have in the WinForm app. So we say system.windows.messagebox.show. And that will show our message. So in theory, that should take care of actually scoring the matchup. Now let's see if it actually works. First tourney. Unplayed, everybody's played. Let's go down to basketball tournament. How about this one right here? All right. So our test WPF tournament, we have Greg's team versus Garanimals. Well, I think Greg's team probably would score 10 points. Hit score. Notice that went off the list. Why? Well, if we uncheck the box, Greg's team now has a score of 10. Garanimals has a score of 0. If we go away from this and come back to it, it still has a score of 10 and 0. If we were to close this out and start it back up again, wait for it. Let's go down to our test, and Greg's team still has a score of 10 versus Garanimals 0. So our scoring is working the way we want it to, which means that our entire application is now working. So we can create a tournament. We can show forms and hide forms. Show forms and hide forms. We can load existing tournaments. We can come through and score matches. And it retains the information. So our entire application is now complete as far as functionality goes. Now it's time to do a couple more things to just clean up this application. This is not the prettiest of applications. And in fact, I haven't spent a ton of time making it pretty. And that's kind of intentional because I want to keep the size of these lessons smaller if I could. And it's also because that's a whole nother entire series on making pretty WPF applications. And it's probably not one that I'm well qualified to teach, just because my design eye is not that of a true designer. I'm more of a copy kind of guy. I can make it look a certain way based upon you telling me this is what I want. That's neither here nor there. What I want to get to, though, is I do want to make a couple changes here to make this look a little better. The biggest one is taking away this really tight border right here, which we talked about for a little while now. So let's do that right away. And that would be in the shell. So let's open this up and go to the shell view. And in here, we have our stack panel here, which that's all of our create tournament and our existing tournaments. And then we have our control for everything else. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to add a margin. And we're going to say that we need a 10 pixel border on the left, and let's do nothing on the right. You can't, not in a content control. So there is a solution for this, though. So let's do that. Let's wrap the entire thing in a border. And we'll start with just that, and we'll put the content control inside. Then let's take all of our information and cut it out and paste it in the border. So now the border is the one that has the margin, the grid row and column, and it just has the content control inside. Now we can say the border brush is, let's say, gray. Let's start there. And let's put this line up here. Border thickness, let's say 1. Now if we run this, we should see we have a border around our section where we put stuff. There it is. So now there's the first turning that goes right inside there. Create turning goes right inside. The only problem is that it really does crunch it up right against the border. But that's okay. We have a solution for that. We can either put a margin on our content control or put padding on our border. Let's put a margin on our content control. It's really simple. We can put a margin of, let's say, 5. And that should allow us to have just a little bit of space between the border and the edge of our items. So now we have a little bit of space all around. And you can play around with putting more or less. But now this kind of differentiates or shows us where the section is that we're working on. Now I do notice the one thing we haven't done yet is we have not put the tournament name. So that's a problem. Let's go ahead and rectify that by filling that in. And that's one of those things, the more you play these kind of things, the more you find those little problems that you've created or little issues that you haven't yet resolved. So in this case, we have tournament name. Now we can leave it at tournament name, or we can actually go in and say whenever this changes, just pull a tournament name. But I think what I want to do is actually have a separate property for that. But let's first start with trying just grabbing the tournament name from the tournament property. So that would look like this. Tournament underscore tournament name. Let's try that and see if it shows up the way you want. Now I'll show you why I want to change it in a minute, but first testing tourney. So the question is, do we leave it like this, or do we say we want tournament colon and then the name? If we wanted that, what we need to do is change to an actual property of its own. If we did that on the get, we could return both the tournament colon and then the tournament name. So let's just show how you do that. So we come down here, and let's actually put it near the top. So I'd do prop full string underscore tournament name, like so. I would drag this up to the top up here, since it's actually the top of our list. Get rid of the extra spacing, and I'd put my notify here, even though it's not technically necessary. We do not actually change the tournament value while we use this form. It's really staying the same, but that's okay. Now, here's where I'd make my change in the return. So right now I return just the underscore tournament name. But what I really want to return is I want to return, and let's do a $, my double quotes, and I'll say tournament colon, open my curly braces, close my curly braces, and close my double quotes. So now it's going to say tournament : and then tournament name, even though the actual tournament name is all that's stored in the private backing field. Now on the constructors call, when we load the model, we should also say tournament name equals model.tournament name. We could also say tournament.tournament name. It's just we already have the model there, so it's a little shorter. With that being said, I can grab this, and instead of calling the tournament and then the property tournament name, I'll just call tournament name directly, which is a different property directly on my view model, and that should give me that tournament : and then the name. And it does. So there it gives me a little bit more like what we had in the WinForm app. So that's all there is to the tournament viewer. Now our application, as far as a functionality standpoint, is complete. You can definitely tweak this and play with it. I'd love to see it made even more pretty. That'd be kind of fun to see. And also, if you want to start getting into animations, that'd probably be the next place I'd go to make this thing look and act even cooler. Before we complete, though, the one thing I want to show you is a question that comes up quite often when it comes to creating these types of applications, and that is, how do I deploy it? Now, when it comes to a website, that's a pretty easy deployment process. There's actually a publish button where you actually publish your application or your website. With executable applications like WinForm application or WPF applications, the story is a little more murky. I'll show you the easiest way to do things, and then you can decide if you want to do something different. Now, so far we've been using the debug mode. Now, if I was going to deploy this application, I would change this dropdown to release mode. Once I did that, I would say build solution. Once it's complete, which it just completed, then I can right-click on Tracker WPF UI, open folder in File Explorer, go to my bin folder, release, and really all of this you copy and paste. Now, you don't really need all of it. You don't need the XML files. All these XML files can go. The other thing you can go, but you probably should save, is the PDB files. Right now there's two of them. One for tracker library.dll. It also has a PDB file. And so does tracker WPF UI. It has a corresponding PDB file. Those two will allow you later on down the road to attach the debugger to the built application. So the common practice is to save those somewhere on your network if you're a corporate environment, or to save those on your hard drive if you are just, an individual user. The key here, though, is each time you build this application, you need to save the corresponding PDB files. So if you build it today and save those files and then build it again tomorrow, today's PDB files won't work with tomorrow's built application. So you have to have that copy of the PDB files. So it always changes based upon when you built it. But grab copy that and paste it somewhere else, and as long as they have the .NET framework installed on their computer, it will run. And typically, if they have a Windows machine that's up to date, it will run. So there's not really a problem there as far as copying and pasting. That's not the best deployment solution, but it's the story we have that's easiest. Now you can create an add-on project for your application. I'm not even sure if we have it installed by default. Let's do a new project. But under other languages, nope, I don't see it installed here. But sometimes you'll see like an installer, or under other languages there's a deployment or something like that. But I'll just search for install. No items found. Also setup. What you can do is look for extensions out in the extensions library. So tools, extensions, and updates. You can find an installer of your choice. There used to be some built in. Now I don't think there are, but I do think that Microsoft provides a package that will install one for you. So if you search for installer, so you can look for a different installer, like a Wix installer or others. But really, this gets into some complicated stuff. It might be easiest just to copy and paste those EXEs unless you really, really need an MSI installer, in which case you need to do some research on that. And I'll probably provide some videos on my YouTube channel on how to do MSI install applications. But for now, what I'd say is copy and paste those DLLs, the config file, and the EXEs, and you should be good to go. Just put it on a different machine. All right. So that is Tournament Tracker converted over to a WPF application using Caliburn Micro. I hope that we covered all the topics you were hoping to cover, and I hope that you follow along and was able to make the same application, but also then take it to the next level as you learned these new techniques and tips. So I'd love to hear what you think about this. Send me an email, tim@imtimcorey.com, and let me know how you made out with your project. All right. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.